everyone, my name is Allie and welcome to my channel. It is finally time for my July wrap up and I'm so excited to talk about these books. I ended up reading 6 books this month and I think I had a pretty good reading month if I do say so myself. Usually I feel like I have something to complain about, but this time around I feel like I honestly read some pretty solid books and ended up having a lot of fun reading them. So let's just jump right on in. So the first book that I ended up reading in July was Here We Go Again by Allison Cochran. And this was kind of like a little bit of a leftover from my Pride Month TBR, but I ended up really enjoying this book. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was a lot of fun and it's a really cute like sapphic road trip kind of book, but it also has a lot of like heavier topics in it as well. Basically it's about these 2 young women. They are both teachers and they have kind of always had this sort of like head buddy sort of thing going on and haven't really been able to get along, but they are both really good friends with one of their former teachers, and he is in the final stages of his cancer and they are taking him on a road trip from, I believe they're in Washington or Oregon. I can't remember if they're in Washington or Oregon, but they're in like the Pacific Northwest and they are taking a trip all the way to Maine. And along the way they kind of like get sidetracked. They have some other little like offshooting plot points here and there, but ultimately it is a romance between these 2 teachers and they do a lot of like growth together and it's really beautiful to watch. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so much fun despite a lot of the heavier topics, and yeah, they did definitely like emotionally get to me, but I thought that it was all for the best. I will say that I know that this is something that a lot of people don't really like. This book did have a lot of pop culture references, so if you're the type of reader who is not really into that, I totally understand. This might not be the book for you. For me personally, I don't really mind a handful or so of pop culture references. I kind of understand that it's just like what books do. There are very few books, even historically, that don't have pop culture references of the time. Like I think it's a lot harder to kind of like understand, because like if we're reading Shakespeare, we're not really reading the plays and being like, oh, that's a pop culture reference, oh, that's a pop culture reference, because it's so historical that we just don't register it as a pop culture reference of the time, even though it is. Same with like Jane Austen or Louisa May Alcott or anybody like that. Like they have plenty of pop culture references of the time. We just don't see them that way. So it'll be really interesting to see if like people 50, 100 years from now will read books from this time period and see our pop culture references as just like historical things. That'll be really intriguing. And I also wonder if like people of those time periods, like back in like the 1800s or like the 1600s or whatever, read books or saw plays or whatever that had pop culture references and were like, really? You know what I mean? I wonder if they had the same reactions that a lot of us have. Anyway, I don't want to go on a tangent. I just always think that that's a really funny thing to be like annoyed by. I totally understand it because it can get a little like, it feels like self-referential. It feels like very like you're being really self-aware of the time period that you're in. So I can totally understand how that would be really annoying. However, I do also think it's kind of silly. If you are the type of reader who doesn't really like a pop culture reference, maybe skip this one. The next book I read is actually the first book in a romance sort of like connected book series that I actually started, I believe, was it last year or 2 years ago? I can't remember at this point. It might have been last year. But I believe that I read the other book in this series, like the second book, last year. But the first one is When in Rome by Sarah Adams, and I ended up giving this book, I believe, a 4 out of 5 stars as well. I don't feel like I loved it quite as much as Practice Makes Perfect, which is the second book in the series. However, I did really enjoy this one. It's kind of like a fish out of water sort of romance story. It's about this young woman, and she is a pop star, and she kind of like runs away from her life, has a sort of like Roman holiday-esque adventure, and ends up meeting this guy, and he is the owner of a pie shop in this small town. I believe is it Rome, Kentucky? Yeah, I believe it's Rome, Kentucky. I might be wrong about that. I will fact check myself in editing. But yeah, that's basically the entire premise of this first book. And I found it to be really fun, really lighthearted, really cute. So far from what I've read of Sarah Adams, I really enjoy her romances. They're very lighthearted, they're very easy to read, and I feel like a lot of her romances are just very engaging and you really do get invested in them. I feel like the reason I didn't give this book a 5 out of 5 stars is that there were just like a few elements that didn't totally work for me, or just didn't really feel fully realized or fleshed out. But I think that my biggest problem with this book is mainly the fact that like I just did not believe that this main character is a pop star. You know what I mean? Like, she just didn't have that energy. I just couldn't really believe it. I didn't really see anything in this book, like in text, of it showing that she's a pop star. I really wish it had been a little bit more of like Hannah Montana the movie-esque, you know what I mean? Like where that is also kind of a fish out of water sort of storyline, a little bit of a Roman holiday kind of thing. However, I mean, maybe it's just because like you already know Hannah Montana, you know that she's a pop star, you know Miley, you know, whatever. But like for some reason, this main character just did not give off the pop star energy. Like, she didn't really seem super creative, she didn't really seem super engaged with her music, and I guess that could kind of be like, well, at this point in the character's life, she's not really into being a pop star. Like, she kind of wants to run away from that lifestyle, which I understand. However, I just don't feel like I was convinced of the fact that she's a pop star. It just kind of felt like a character trait that the author gave her and just kind of left it up to the reader to believe it or not believe it. You know what I mean? I would rather be convinced. I don't want to just be told that she's a pop star. I want to be shown that she's a pop star, if you get what I mean. But otherwise, I did really enjoy this book, and I think that it also kind of set me off for like a weird experience reading this book, because I read the second book first, and the second book has more to do with her bodyguard, and he's like the male love interest in that book. And I felt like when I read that book, I assumed that in When in Rome, he would have a bigger role. You know what I mean? Like, or like he would have any kind of role. I kept reading this book and being like, where is that guy? Like, I thought that he was gonna play a bigger role in this story, but he really doesn't. Like, I don't think he actually shows up until the end of the book. And I'm like, why should I be invested in him now? Like, I don't get it. Anyway, I enjoyed this book, and I highly recommend that you check out this series. I do still think that Practice Makes Perfect is a little bit better, but they're still both really great books and a good series. Okay, so I am in a completely different outfit on a completely different day. However, I was editing this wrap up and I realized that there was an issue with like half of the footage that I was able to get, so I unfortunately have to redo some of that footage. So we need to get on to the next book. So the next book that I ended up reading was Such a Bad Influence by Olivia Munter, and this is sort of like a soft thriller kind of book. It focuses on these two sisters who grew up and their parents ran a family vlog channel, and the older sister was always kind of like anti the vlog channel. She never really liked it, and she never really wanted to be the focus of those videos. However, the younger sister was a lot more into it and seemed to be like their mother's favorite, and kind of ended up building an influencer platform based off of her success on the family vlog channel. And so one day when the younger sister is on a live, I think on like Instagram or TikTok or something like that, she ends up going missing and everybody's looking for her. It's kind of like this big scandal. And I don't know if any of you have watched this documentary. It's on Netflix and I believe it's called Dancing for the Devil. it definitely reminded me of that documentary. And I had actually watched it before reading this book, and even before I believe that I'd ever gotten recommended this book, and they are very similar, and I think that that's why I ended up liking this book a little bit more than some other people did. This was kind of like a middle of the road book for me. I have to admit that I'm not much of a thriller reader. However, I did think that this book was really interesting, and it is kind of topical because I feel like we've been having a lot of conversations about family vlogging, influencing, stuff like that, kids on the internet. And so I feel like if you are kind of like into that sort of conversation right now, you might really enjoy this book. The next book that I picked up was The Wedding People by Allison S. Batch. And this is an ARC that I got a while ago, but I was also able to get an audiobook ALC. I always like feel like I'm tripping over my words every time I try to explain what that is. So I was able to listen to it as an audiobook before the book even came out, and I ended up really enjoying this book. I ended up giving this book 4 stars, and this one follows a woman in, I don't know, in like her 40s, I believe. And she is an adjunct professor, and she's been married to another fellow professor. And they end up going through a divorce. She just kind of takes a nosedive in her mental health, and she plans this trip to Rhode Island, to Newport, and books a really nice hotel, and does this all in order to you probably hear my dogs right now. They're going nuts. And she does this all in order to commit suicide. But when she gets to this hotel in Newport, she finds out that the majority of the hotel has been rented out for a wedding, and somehow, just like by coincidence, she has booked it on the same weekend, and they weren't supposed to give her a room, but they did. So she kind of ends up getting entangled into the lives of the people at the wedding, and especially the life of the bride. And so that kind of like derails her plans and sets her on this new path. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really funny. There were so many moments where I was just like laughing out loud while listening to this book. And I think what I also really loved about it is that I have been to Newport. I went to Newport in the beginning of June, and I absolutely loved it. One of my new favorite places ever. And so it was kind of cool to like read this book and have some sense of like, I know where this is, I know where that is, I've been there before. So that was a lot of fun. And yeah, I highly recommend this book. I think it was really interesting, but obviously content warning for suicide and mental health and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely recommend this one. If you guys have been watching my vlogs or following me on social media or whatever, you know that this summer has been an Eve Babbitt's summer for me. And so I finally picked up Slow Days, Fast Company by Eve Babbitt. This is another collection of short stories. And as you guys know, in June, I picked up Black Swans, which I really loved. I gave that one 5 out of 5 stars. And I know that a lot of people prefer Slow Days, Fast Company, but I feel like it might be more of like whichever one you end up picking up first is what you're going to love more. And so I picked up Black Swans first, and I feel like I love that one a little bit more than Slow Days, Fast Company. This one was good too. This one had a kind of like an interesting collection of short stories, whereas Black Swans focused a lot more on Los Angeles itself. This one focused a little bit more on like California in general, which I did end up really enjoying. I believe that there was 1 or 2 stories about Central California, which I found to be really intriguing because I feel like you don't really get to read a lot about Central California. Where I live in California, I'm kind of like right in the middle. I'm like in the middle between Central California and LA. So it was kind of interesting to see like some more of like this side of California instead of the other side. But I just felt like there were some stories, especially towards the end of the collection, that just felt a little forgettable and just like didn't really resonate fully with me. I did really enjoy, like I said, the stories that were about Central California. There was a story that was about Dodger games and like baseball, which I found to be obviously really intriguing. I love baseball. I have been to many a Dodger game in my life, even though I'm not like a Dodger fan. It was really interesting to see her perspective on like going to a baseball game and not really having any sort of like idea of what baseball is before going into seeing the game with somebody. But as always, like the writing is really refreshing, it's really engaging. You really do feel like you are right there with her, like you're her bestie. And just like the way that she characterizes California, especially Los Angeles, it's just like it really brings that city to life and gives you like a totally different perspective on that city. So highly recommend it, whether you live in LA, live in California, or you don't. I think that her writing is really, really interesting, and especially during the summer, it's like perfect to get into. And the very last book that I read in the month of July was 40 Love by Olivia Dade. This book follows a woman, I believe that she's like 39 at the beginning of the book. I don't remember, yeah, she does have her birthday. But she's like turning 40, and her and one of her really good friends plan a trip to a resort in Florida, and they're both teachers, they're both really burnt out, and they're just looking for like a nice vacation to go and relax and like be besties and whatever. And while she is on this trip with her best friend, she ends up meeting this guy that works at the resort as a tennis instructor, and they end up really hitting it off. And they have this really funny scene in the beginning of the book where she is in the water and she ends up losing her bikini top and he has to come help and save her. It's really, really cute. I really loved this romance. I've had like hit or miss experiences with Olivia Dade's romances in the past, but I had a feeling about this one being like kind of a semi-sports romance, being set during the summer, and just looking like so much fun that I knew I was going to really like it. I believe I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. It was just a lot of fun. I felt like these two characters had really great chemistry. I really enjoyed the main character, which I feel like is kind of like what hinges for me, like the romance, what makes the romance what it is. I liked both of these characters separately and together. And yeah, like I didn't really have any like huge critiques on this book. There were some moments that like didn't fully work for me. There were some things, like especially dialogue wise, that just felt a little bit unrealistic to me and would take me out of the narrative, but it wasn't like huge egregious things. They were definitely things that I could kind of like overlook, and I was still really enjoying this romance and this story. So yeah, I highly recommend it if you're looking for an adult romance book that focuses on an older main character. There is a little bit of an age gap there. He's in his like mid-20s. She's obviously in her late 30s, early 40s, but I really enjoyed it. I really loved it, and it was interesting getting to learn a little bit more about tennis. Tennis is a sport that just completely goes right over my head. I love to watch it, but I don't really know what I'm watching. So it was really interesting to read as someone who's not really into tennis. And yeah, I mean, this is a great book. It's a great plus-size romance, and I highly recommend it. So yeah, that was my entire July wrap-up. I feel like so weird that I had to refilm this section. I hope that I didn't glaze over these last like 4 books a little too much, but I just felt like I'd already talked about them and I'm gonna have to talk about them again. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this wrap up anyway, and if you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!